Hey everyone, author MJ Gallagher here and welcome back to Rebirth Revealed, a series presented and funded by CupoCon. This episode covers a load of details and lore that you may have missed in the side quests and optional content of Chapter 2, A New Journey Begins. Spoilers beyond this part of the game are minimal, but please beware of likely spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII, its remake, and the compilation in general. Now let's hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and jump right in. One of the most universally praised aspects of Rebirth is the sheer volume and variety of things to do. In addition to side quests and minigames is World Intel, where the player can explore each region to learn about the area, battle unique enemies, unlock Moogle Emporiums, or enhance the power of summoned beings, for example. A lot of this revolves around life springs, which are crystallised fonts where the lifestream has breached the surface. These allow Cloud to tap into the planet's knowledge on behalf of Chadley, and the player is typically guided to them by Spring Seeker Owls. Owls, of course, are birds traditionally associated with knowledge and wisdom, something that's even highlighted during Mai's enemy intel of the Zemzalit variants in the Junon region, by referring to them as Sages of the Skies. The symbolism dates back to the classical era, in which owls represented the goddess of wisdom herself. To the Romans, this was Minerva, who, according to the compilation's extended media, just happens to share a name with the personified will of the lifestream. Scores of mythical entities from around the world have featured in the franchise since the very first Final Fantasy in 1987. Another early example of this in Rebirth is the so-called winged Lacertilian of yore, Quetzalcoatl, who is described in battle as a cross between a dragon and a bird, and is said to have been revered by the ancient peoples of the grasslands. Assessing the beast will reveal that its species has existed since antiquity, and can command lightning, as can be seen when it electrifies its whole body. This isn't simply a callback to the avian thunder element Guardian Force introduced in Final Fantasy VIII, but to an important deity in the historic cultures of Mesoamerica, such as the Maya or Aztecs. Quetzalcoatl was a god closely associated with wind and thunderstorms. He was bringer of rains that enabled crops to grow, and was most often depicted in ancient times as a feathered serpent or a flying reptile. To the Aztecs, snakes represented the earth, while birds represented the sky, so a plumed serpent symbolised the boundary between the two, as well as the eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth. As we'll see, the latter aspect is a common theme in this chapter. In any case, such an intrinsic connection to the elements is why the Quetzalcoatl Talon is a key component for transmuting the windmill gear. It allows Mildred to get the huge blades of the mill spinning again, and thus able to generate electricity from wind power. The life springs themselves identify the locations of long-buried transmuter chips, which the player can use while crafting. Believe it or not, the concept of utilising the lifestream to find missing items has appeared in the compilation before, as a hoax service provided by Kyrie Kanan in The Kids Are Alright, an official novel by Rebirth's lead scenario writer Kazushige Najima. Kyrie, a con artist from the Sector 5 slums, plays a small role in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and actually shows up in one of this chapter's side quests, having duped the Mayor of Calm into thinking she's a hotshot mercenary. In order to fix a leak on the local Mako pipeline, the girl sends Cloud to search for parts among the scrap heaps of Calm's outskirts. This is perhaps an allusion to The Kids Are Alright, which explains how Kyrie and her friends give up pickpocketing and begin scouring the Sector 7 ruins after Meteorfall, because they can make more money by finding and selling certain items and materials. After the player collects the parts, Kyrie leads the way to the pipeline, and asks the group if her grandma has sent them to bring her back to Midgar. It's revealed in Chapter 14 of Remake that her grandma is none other than Mireille, a career con artist and local hero, affectionately known as the guardian angel of the slums. This is also where the name of the agency Kyrie runs in The Kids Are Alright, Mireille's investigative services, comes from. I mentioned in the previous episode that the contrasting stamp designs indicate the main party is in a separate reality from Zack. It's worth highlighting that Zack leaves the Mako poison cloud with Kyrie during Rebirth's opening, so the absence of any reference to that here may be a deliberate attempt to create ambiguity. However, this is far less subtle than Kyrie failing to acknowledge Aerith, because the two knew each other when they were younger. In fact, as noted in The Kids Are Alright, Aerith's unusual connection to the livestream is what gave Kyrie the idea of pretending she can use it to locate missing people and items in the first place. Another phenomenon that Rebirth introduces to the Final Fantasy VII universe is Proto Relics, and each region has a unique questline for them. Chadley initially believes these proto-relics to be the remnants of ancient artifacts that are emanating strange energy signals, and prompts Cloud to investigate. The first signal can be tracked to the lookout on the northeast cape, where the party run into Beck's Badasses, a group of petty criminals that are encountered a few times during Remake. Among them is the Grunge Bandit, who originally fights alongside the Crooks during the Garden Angle 3 side quest in Wall Market, which itself relates to Kyrie's grandmother. The big guy has now been given the name Burt to continue the alliteration of Beck, Burke and Butch. Eventually pursuing the bandits to their hideout, where, as is the solution to every problem, they're playing dead, Cloud has the option to negotiate with the badasses as legitimate businessmen. Beck goes on to say that they are trying to make a fresh start with honest work by finding and selling treasure. Cloud offers them 2,000 gil for the proto-relic in their possession, which brings me back to the point I raised in my second episode about the importance of this particular sum of money. According to the short story by Kazushige Najima, it's self-titled 2,000 gil to become a hero. Cloud's dad used to have the philosophy that a person can make a fresh start with 2,000 gil in their wallet. This is likely why Cloud charges that exact amount in Final Fantasy VII Remake to assist Avalanche in the bombing of Mako Reactor 1. The proto-relic Beck found is a piece of glowing armour. When Cloud holds it up, he receives an unexpected vision of a figure with multiple arms, clad in red, who is sitting by a pool of water opposite a big bridge. Fans of the wider Final Fantasy series will no doubt have quickly realised who this figure is. In any case, his horned headgear matches an outfit made available in 2022 for the now cancelled Battle Royale mobile game The First Soldier. He is of course Gilgamesh, the interdimensional traveller, hence the unusual energy signals emitted from artefacts associated with him. The player can start Final Fantasy VII Rebirth with as many as 8 summoned creatures in their arsenal, depending on downloadable bonus content or previous save files for Remake and Intermission. For each new region they visit, however, they will be given the opportunity to have Chadley produce an orb of artificial materia that can call that area's guardian deity into battle. Cloud assists in the process by visiting the local sanctuaries and shrines to these summons to unlock the divine knowledge slumbering within the crystals there. On approaching the centrepiece, the player may note there are shimmering wisps of spiritual energy above it, encircled by holographic rings of unusual letters. These are exactly the same characters that appear around the glowing sphere when a summoned being is invoked. Chadley explains that sanctuaries are sites at which fragments of planetary wisdom have come together in crystalline forms, and this includes the secrets, or consciousness, of the divine. Incredibly, this is by no means a concept that's new to Rebirth. During Chapter 8 of Remake, Chadley remarks that scientists have thought until now that summon materia could only be formed in nature. There's a very good reason for this, but the details were cut from the released version of the original Final Fantasy VII. Unused text from the Temple of the Ancients sequence reveals that such entities coexisted with the Cetra and elected to seal their consciousness inside materia so as to live forever. This is further supported in Remake, which implies Shiva, Ifrit and Bahamut all interacted with the Ancients. What might have come as a surprise to fans of the old game though, is that the deiform of the Grasslands region is Titan, a mythical colossus whose elemental affiliation is Earth, and whose materia was previously acquired at the destroyed Gallagher reactor. Several pieces of lore on Titan are provided by breaking the illuminated guidestones en route to his shrines. It's said that in the Age of Myths, Titan rose from his subterranean prison, causing a giant earthquake. The vast swathe of land that emerged from the sea as a result is believed to have become the Grasslands. According to local legends, Titan possesses so much strength that he's capable of crushing whole mountains with his fists. The native peoples once feared that earthquakes would occur if they angered the deity, suggesting Calm's present-day harvest festival most likely originated as a ritual offering of crops to appease him. As I touched on before, it's common knowledge that the franchise as a whole draws inspiration from real-world mythologies. That said, it's particularly prominent in Final Fantasy VII, thanks in large to scenario writer Kazushika Najima, whose professional background before joining Square was writing and directing video games based on ancient Greek myths. The lore surrounding Titan and Rebirth is another prime example of this. In the best known version of the Greek creation story, the Titans are primordial beings and children of Gaia, the personified Mother Earth. They eventually went to war against the next generation of gods, the Olympians, and the 10-year conflict that ensued is called the Titanomachy. So seismic were the battles of the Titanomachy that the very Earth itself was reshaped, forming hills and valleys. The Titans were ultimately overpowered by the gods and their boulder-hurling allies, the Hecatoncheires, and were imprisoned deep beneath the ground. For this, the Olympians incurred the wrath of Gaia. From this myth alone, we can identify many elements that likely influenced the Grasslands folklore in Rebirth, as well as Titan himself. For instance, his attacks when summoned are Mountain Crusher and Boulder Hurl, which can both be linked to the Titanomachy, while his finishing move is Earth and Fury, a name that's interchangeable across the series with Gaia's Wrath. Sticking with classical mythology, Chapter 2 makes reference to historic beliefs as a way to subtly symbolise the theme of rebirth. The ancient Greeks closely associated the cycle of life, death and rebirth with the cycle of the seasons, particularly the growing and harvesting of crops. Two important cults for those were Demeter and Dionysus, the goddess of the harvest and the god of winemaking respectively. The Great Festival of Demeter each year included clandestine ceremonies concerning the cycle of life. This was represented by her daughter Persephone, whose annual emergence from the underworld heralded springtime and the sowing of crops, and whose return to Hades marked the coming of winter and the withering of vegetation. Similarly, the celebrations surrounding Dionysus evolved over time from customs honouring grapes being brought to the winepress to the Orphic cult rituals recounting the tale of his death, at the hands of the Titans no less, and rebirth. Dionysus' festival became the largest and most important in Athens, and a core part of it was theatrical performances. Considering all this, I don't think it's a coincidence that so much of the activity around Calm relates to the upcoming Harvest Festival. For example, as I alluded to in the previous episode, the women dancing at Makotang Plaza are practicing a routine for the festivities, which is verified by a handful of NPCs dotted around the town. And then there are the trucks and stalls selling seasonal vegetables, presumably grown on the many farms that can be visited across the Grasslands, or the unusual abundance of wine and whiskey advertisements throughout Calm, whose possible connection to the winemaking aspect of Dionysus is further supplemented by an elderly gentleman in the Rusty Arrow bar, where he remarks on the delicacy of the region's grapes and the vintage they produce. And, just for good measure, there's even the rehearsal of a theatrical performance, the real-world roots of which can be explicitly traced back to Dionysian festivals. Following on from this, I mentioned in my last video that the name of Chocobo Bill's granddaughter, Chloe, has deeper meaning, and drew parallels to a classical tale. However, Chloe is also one of the common monikers of Demeter, which might explain why her stall is also filled with vegetables. What's even more interesting about this is that the optional side quest presented by the young stablehand relates to the gathering of wildflowers, so she can make flower crowns like her deceased mother used to. Scholars believe the secret of ceremonies held during the annual Festival of Demeter included a dramatic reenactment of the myth in which her daughter Persephone is first taken to the underworld by Hades, king of the dead. This occurs while Persephone is out picking wildflowers in a meadow with friends, and it's what ultimately leads to the cycle of the seasons. I'd particularly like to bring your attention to the colours and species of flowers here, because their visual connection to the afterlife will appear again much later in the game. And if you talk to Chocobo Bill after the quest has been completed, he'll remark that he wishes the parents of Billy and Chloe were still around, revealing their names to be Will and Clara. This is a wholesome little family link, as Bill, Will and Billy are all shortened versions of William. One of the major new lore and world building elements that has been introduced by Rebirth is the existence of the Republic of Junon. A handful of references are made to it in the official novel Traces of Two Pasts, but this chapter of the game is where the groundwork is really laid. I'll discuss it further in future episodes, but in short, the Republic was a widespread seafaring nation that existed before the Shinra company rose to power. Remnants of the old Republic can be found all over, from the stone ramparts and archaic townhouses of Calm to the windmills and grain silos of the grasslands, or in monuments to its maritime history, such as the ship's wheel and navigational compass design at the lookout, and derelict transport routes, including huge viaducts and chocobo stops whose distinct fragrance attracts juvenile birds. With respect to the latter, Rebirth has continued Remake's Easter egg of having the benches display an image of the Save Crystal icon from Final Fantasy VII, while the signposts match those used by Sam's delivery service in Midgar's slums. Arguably the most intriguing aspect of the Old Republic that can be found across the grasslands are the ruined structures that bear the scars of war. One such example is the destroyed settlement where the transmuter chips are buried, suggesting this may have previously been a location of value. A short distance away is an abandoned tank. Cloud identifies it as a dated Shinra model, leading the others to conclude it was probably used during the war with the Republic and that the area had been a battlefield. This is supported by the wooden boxes scattered around the tank, bearing insignia distinct from anything we saw in Remake. It also raises the question of whether the ruins here are in any way connected to the bombing of Calm. As I've already touched on in the last two episodes, it was initially disclosed during Before Crisis that parts of the town, including its central plaza, were shelled in error by the Shinra army due to a miscommunication between the military and Chief Verdo of the Turks. The intended target was located 50 kilometers north of Calm, but the signal was lost during Verdo's transmission. While this is speculative on my part, the world maps for both the original Final Fantasy VII and Rebirth suggest that 50 kilometers north of Calm places the target offshore. This ties in with forthcoming lore that the Republic of Junon was a maritime society. That said, Before Crisis never specifies who the enemy was, but the war had long concluded by then, so it would most likely have been an insurgent group of Republic sympathisers, because Avalanche was not yet active. The whole affair is directly referenced in one of the regional intel panels for the Grasslands. It states that 10 years ago, a significant portion of the town was damaged, though Shinra quickly carried out a reconstruction effort and buried details of the incident. In Before Crisis, Verdo admits to the player that he was personally responsible for erasing traces of the bombing. Most, if not all of the grievance that Brodin holds towards the company is linked to what happened that day. If you return to the inn at Calm and speak with Brodin later in Chapter 2, he tells Cloud that he was a Shinra army grunt in his youth, but that he got out after his parents died. He claims Shinra stole his family and his home from him by destroying Calm, and that the town in its present form is a soulless imitation of the one that he grew up in. I mentioned in the second episode in this series that Shinra's cover-up at Calm parallels the tragedy at Nibelheim and its aftermath. Broden's side quest takes this one step further by establishing a number of direct comparisons between the Innkeeper and Cloud. Some of these are pretty easy to spot for veteran fans, such as Broden complaining of headaches and dizziness, or that he hears voices calling him and urging him to go somewhere. Cloud of course experiences headaches throughout Remake, while one of the big twists of the original game is that his obsession with pursuing Sephiroth is because the Jenova cells in his body are responding to the reunion drive, and the real Sephiroth summoning him to the Northern Crater. Broden later reveals that he wasn't just a Shinra trooper, but a member of Soldier, and that his condition is likely due to cellular degradation. In Chapter 7 of Remake, President Shinra states that this is the most common cause of death in soldiers, which is something that Cloud begins to concern himself with more and more as Rebirth progresses. Curing his cellular degradation is also the primary motivation for Genesis during Crisis Core. Interestingly, that game and its accompanying Ultimanias do specify that the phenomenon is unique to G-type soldiers, which Cloud is not. As an aside, the Jenova cells in Broden's body are likely the scent from Hojo's lab that Red 13 picks up on. Given the man's current symptoms and burning desire to leave Calm, perhaps we'll cross paths with him again in one form or another. If so, the cleansing materia that's obtained by completing the windmill element of Broden's side quest, which is used to heal poison or other status afflictions, might be a dark joke by the developers. Another job in Chapter 2 that contains a fair amount of old and new Final Fantasy VII lore is tracking down a rare card for Vash, one of the barmen at the Rusty Arrow. At the conclusion of the quest, he shows his gratitude by making Cloud and Tifa a Cosmo Canyon cocktail based on a recipe he recently learned from a former patron of 7th Heaven. You may recall, Tifa makes the same for Cloud after he returns from the Mako Reactor 1 bombing during Remake. Having tasted Vash's drink, she recommends adding a pinch of salt to spruce it up. It's discovered later in Rebirth that Cosmo Canyon itself is famous for its salt mines, hence the flavour addition. There's also a lot more weight to this moment for Tifa than meets the eye, but I'll come back to that in due course. As for what Vash's rare card was, that finally brings us to Queen's Blood. Queen's Blood of course is everyone's favourite new card game. As with similar minigames in the series, such as Final Fantasy VIII's Triple Triad and Final Fantasy IX's Tetramaster, Queen's Blood encourages the player to win and collect various cards to build their deck. Vash hires Cloud to win back his Chocobo and Moogle card. This is a nice little detail because Chocobo and Moogle is the summon materia that Cloud has equipped at the start of Rebirth, which, in turn, is based on the Chocomog summon of the original Final Fantasy VII that can be acquired at Bill's Chocobo Ranch. The quest eventually leads the player to a card collector's shop out in the grasslands. The owner is a man called Thorin, and his cabin includes several trophies, with the one on the top shelf matching the prize for winning the Queen's Blood tournament aboard a certain ship. As for the collector's name, this is very likely based on the character Thorin Oakenshield from The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, the most famous fantasy author of them all. Thorin is a dwarven king who displays a greed for treasure and the power that it brings him. However, in the story he does present Bilbo with a coat of mail made from mithril, which is a fictional metal mined by dwarves. The mithril mine in Final Fantasy VII is almost certainly a nod to Tolkien's Middle-earth, so it makes sense for the Grasslands Collector of Treasures to be named after Thorin Oakenshield. This is probably also why orcs can be found lurking near the entrance to his shop. Anyway, Thorin explains that the name of Queen's Blood comes from the legend of a queen who ruled the world until she was deposed and killed by her people, and from her blood sprung the fiends of the planet. What's interesting about this is that most titles and accompanying media within the compilation identify monsters being the result of flora and fauna mutating through overexposure to Mako. However, a passage from Sung in the novel The Kids Are Alright suggests the first fiends were produced by the dissemination of Genova's virus when she arrived on the planet 2000 years ago. I wonder if these stories crossed over somewhere in history. I'll talk more about Queen's Blood over the course of the video series because the card game actually has its own lore and subplot. Without getting into spoilers, little references to this are hidden in plain sight right from the start. For example, on the board itself, the player and their opponent place cards on tiles adorned by emerald pawns and ruby pawns respectively. Furthermore, the rarest transmutable materials in the early chapters are emerald and ruby gemstones, eventually used in the crafting of magical accessories. And there is a pair of posters found throughout Rebirth which relate to the planetary guardians from the original Final Fantasy VII. These of course allude to the emerald weapon and ruby weapon. As for the relevance of all this, I guess I'll save that for another time. Well folks, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video and invite you to check out all future episodes on KupoCon's channel. If you're interested in the lore side of things, my own books, Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, are both available on Amazon. As always, I'd especially like to thank all of KupoCon's Patreon subscribers for your continued support. Without your backing, productions such as this would not be possible. If you're not already a patron, please do consider joining for some incredible KupoCon exclusives. But for now, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.